Thank you, Chris. It's good to see all of you here tonight for our evening worship service. You know, I often wonder, we have close to 40 parables that are recorded in the Gospels that Jesus spoke during his earthly ministry, but there had to be scores more that Jesus spoke that, for whatever reason, we don't have those recorded. What we do have is what we need to have. But Jesus spoke really specifically on prayer, really only 2 parables where he dealt specifically with that subject. And I want us tonight to look at those 2 parables. And actually, I would say of all the parables, these are my 2 favorite parables. Now, I know a lot of times preachers say that, this is my favorite passage, but these really are my 2 favorite parables. And so we're going to look at these parables about prayer. And I think there's a lot of information packed into these parables. And then we're going to draw some application from our reading and as we try to interpret them. And so let's look at the first one. It's the friend at midnight, and it's found in Luke chapter 11, verses 5 through 8. Luke chapter 11, verses 5 through 8. And he said to them, "Suppose one of you shall have a friend, and shall go to him at midnight, and say to him, 'Friend, lend me 3 loaves, for a friend of mine has come from a journey, and I have nothing to set before him.' And from inside shall answer and say, 'Do not bother me, the door has already been shut, and my children and I are in bed. I cannot get up and give you anything.' I tell you, even though he will not get up and give him anything because he is his friend, yet because of his persistence, he will get up and give him as much as he needs." And so the Lord tells of one who had an unexpected midnight visitor. Now, this may seem rather strange. I think you would probably consider it strange if someone started knocking at your door at midnight. But you have to remember, back in this time period, it was often hot during the day, and so people would often travel as they traveled by foot at night. So it wouldn't be that unusual for someone to come to your door in the middle of the night and want to stay with you. Because he had no food to set before the guest, he went to a neighbor who had already retired for the night with his children, and he requested 3 loaves of bread. Now, again, we think of a loaf of bread, we think of what it looks like when we go to the grocery store. But a loaf was really a flat cake. So 3 flat cakes. And it's kind of interesting, baking bread in those days was communal work. So the women of the village would all come together and bake bread. And it would be known who had baked recently. Now, there may have been some bread left over in this man's house, but he had to offer his guest an unbroken loaf. To feed a guest with a partial loaf would have been considered an insult. It's like someone comes to your house and you kind of, you may do this, but you might go, "Well, here's something we've already kind of ate on. You want it?" We really wouldn't do that, right? We want to give them a fresh piece of cake, or a fresh cake, or a fresh pie, not something that's just a little bit left. And so that was kind of the mindset in that time period. The neighbor replied, "Do not bother me. The door has already been shut, and my children and I are in bed, and I cannot get up to give you anything." And when it says the door was shut, it was an elaborate affair to shut your door. And so there were lots of kind of bells and whistles and locks, and it was a big process to lock up for the night. Not so much maybe for us today, but I do know people who've lived like in maybe an inner city area, and there's like chains and locks and padlocks and double locks and, maybe a stick you put by the door and all those kinds of things as you shut things up for the night. So it was a very elaborate affair to have to get up in the middle of the night and undo all of that. So it's easy to see why he was unwilling to do that. In Palestine, the majority of the people were poor, and most of the houses were really one-room cottages. And the house was built on the ground with beaten clay serving as the floor. The animals were usually kept inside to protect them against the weather and to protect them from being stolen or from some kind of predator. In part of this house, a platform was raised above the floor, kind of like on stilts. And it was in this upper area that the family would have slept. So you can imagine, not only did you have this elaborate door to unlock, if you got up from your stilted area, where are you going to wake up? All these animals, right, that are sleeping in your house. So what a mess, right? So, I mean, your kids are sleeping up here, everybody's real nice and cozy in for the night, and the animals are all kind of grazing in the house, right? And so the last thing you want to do is get up and, fool with all that and making all kinds of noise. So it's very natural to understand that the man did not want to get out of bed. It would disturb the entire house. But the desperate host continued to bang on the door outside. Soon it became obvious that if the family was going to get any rest at all, there was nothing else to do but to get up and let the man in and give him the bread that he wanted. And that's how it all turned out. So the second parable that has a similar vein to it is the persistent widow. We had a persistent friend at midnight. Now we have a persistent widow. Again in Luke chapter 18, and let's look at verses 1 through 5. Now he, that is Jesus, was telling them a parable to show that at all times they ought to pray and not lose heart, saying, there was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God and did not respect man. Tells us a little bit about his character. And there was a widow. This is sort of the most vulnerable of people in that day. So a very vulnerable person comes to the judge, give me legal protection from my opponent. Now, we don't know all the details there, but she makes a legitimate request. She would have been someone that you would think a judge would have looked favorably upon, someone who is very vulnerable. And for a while, verse 4, he was unwilling. But afterward, he said to himself, even though I do not fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will give her legal protection, lest by continually coming she wear me out. So this other parable, the parable of the persistent widow, as you can see, is very, very similar. There was a widow in a city who was being oppressed. And in this same city, there was a judge who had no respect for God or for man. The judge was probably a Roman judge because one man could not constitute a Jewish court. So he was probably a Roman, which meant, of course, he was a pagan. The widow kept coming to the judge and pleading her cause, while he continued to give her a deaf ear. Perhaps the judge, like Felix, that we read about later in the New Testament in Acts chapter 24 and verse 26, was delaying the matter, hopefully thinking that a bribe would come his way. But the woman was penniless, and all she could do, all that she had, was her persistence. And she kept badgering and pestering the judge until he finally gave in. It's kind of interesting in verse 5. He says, she's going to wear me out. If you go back to the original language, that phrase, wear me out, means she's going to literally give me a black eye. That's how persistent she was. So much, in fact, that he normally would not grant her that kind of a request. But she was wearing him out, like giving him a black eye. And he said, enough's enough. She's bothering me so much. I'll give her what she desires, legal protection. So, what are some lessons on prayer that we can derive from these very critical parables that Jesus spoke? Taken together, these twin parables teach us much about prayer. And the first thing I think that we can learn is responsibility in prayer. Jesus taught that prayer is an obligation. Luke chapter 18 and verse 1, at all times they ought to pray and not lose heart. Another way to translate this would be to say that men must pray, an obligatory statement. For like the widow and the host, they stand in need of something which they cannot supply for themselves. And that's what drives us to our knees. That's why we speak to God in prayer. God can do something for us that we cannot do for ourselves. In fact, it's kind of interesting. Jesus, upon this earth, in His unique relationship with the Father, still felt it necessary to spend time in prayer. And so look in the book of Luke, just some quick passages here that show that, if Jesus needed prayer, surely we need prayer. Luke chapter 3 and verse 21. Now it came about when all the people were baptized that Jesus was also baptized, and while He was praying, heaven was opened. Still in Luke chapter 6, verses 12 and 13. And it was at that time that He went off to the mountain to pray. Look at Luke chapter 9, 18. Luke 9, 18. And it came about that while He was praying alone. Still chapter 9, drop down to verse 28. And some 8 days after these sayings, it came about that He took Peter and John and James and went up to the mountain to pray. If Jesus needed prayer, if the early church needed prayer, we cannot need less prayer today. I remember when I was in college, the 4 years that I was at Freed-Hardeman, I was actually a tutor at the Center for Personal Development. And some of you are familiar with Freed-Hardeman. There's an old house there called the Joyce Simon McDaniel House. And on the top floor of that house, I was a tutor all 4 years of college. And so one of the people that I worked with was our secretary, and her name was Mary Barton. And her husband, John Barton, was a computer science professor, and very fine people. In fact, before Casey and I got married, I didn't have a place to stay for a short period of time, and they actually let me house sit for them when they were professors over in Vienna, Austria. Great people. Their son and daughter-in-law were missionaries to Uganda. They were Harding graduates who went to Uganda to be missionaries for a number of years. And they told me that in Uganda, people would go to a certain spot behind their house or behind their hut, and they would pray. There was a particular spot everybody had back behind their house where they would go and pray. And the journey from their house to that spot where they would pray was called the Ugandan prayer path. And you could go to somebody's house and look at their prayer path and learn something about their spirituality, right? So if that was a well-trodden path, that told you there's a family that spends a lot of time in prayer. But if that path was full of weeds and was grown over, obviously that's someone who didn't spend a lot of time in prayer. We need prayer. And I wonder if we had a prayer path in our backyard, what it would look like. Would it be a place that we frequent, or would it be a place that we rarely go to? The second thing I think we can learn from these twin parables, are the requirements of prayer. Jesus, really in a capsule form, gives some of the basic requirements or conditions of effective prayer. And first of all, prayer must be direct and it must be definitive. The host went directly to his friend. The widow went directly to the judge. Prayer is very personal and prayer is very individual. It is the meeting of persons in the seclusion of one's closet, as we read about in Matthew 6 and verse 6. Prayer must be definite. I like it when children pray, right? Because children are very specific, aren't they, when they pray? They're very definite. Here are some actual prayers from children. Debbie, age 7. Dear God, please send a new baby for Mommy. The new baby you sent last week cries too much. Jimmy, age 6. Dear God, who did you make smarter, boys or girls? My sister and I want to know. Angela, age 8. Dear God, this is my prayer. Could you please give my brother some brains? So far, he doesn't have any. Hank, age 7. Dear Lord, thank you for the nice day today. You even fooled the weatherman. Agnes, age 6. Dear God, please bring me a new brother. The one I got socks me all the time. This is Lois, age 9. Dear God, please help me in school. I need help in spelling, adding, history, geography, and writing. I don't need help in anything else. Natalie, age 7. Dear God, do you have any helpers in heaven? I would like to be one of your helpers in heaven when I have summer vacation. Susan, age 9. Dear Lord, tomorrow is my birthday. Could you please put a rainbow in the sky? Did you see the one the other night? Did you see the rainbow? It was really pretty, wasn't it? David, age 7. Dear God, I need a raise in my allowance. Could you have one of your angels tell my father? Thank you. And Diane, age 8. Dear God, I am saying my prayers for me and my brother Billy because Billy is 6 months old and he can't do anything but sleep and wet his diapers. So, we kind of laugh at that, but children are very specific, aren't they? They make those requests to God. Friend, give me 3 loaves of bread. That's very specific, isn't it? When we pray, unfortunately, we often do so in generalities, don't we? In fact, our prayers are often so general, the kind of prayers that we sometimes pray here in the public assemblies, they could really be made to fit most any occasion, right? If we were more specific in prayer, we would not be so apt to rhyme off phrase after phrase which really have no meaning. Instead of acknowledging that we are a blessed people, we need to list our blessings to God one by one and thank God for them. Children do that. Adults often don't do that. We should detail our sin, absolutely, and literally, and grievously confessing them to God. I don't think it's enough to say, God, forgive me of any sins I may have committed today. Really? How about the way I talked to my parents, the way I talked to my spouse, the way I had a bad attitude about somebody at work because they got a new car, right? We need to be specific in our prayers to God, definite. We must be frank when we speak to God for Him, but really and more importantly, of course, for us. Prayer must be sincere. In the parables, the host and the widow were utterly sincere in their petitions. Prayer, by its very nature, must come from the heart. The prayers of Jesus were warm with feeling. They were the expressions of intense desires. As you know, the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane was so earnest that Luke chapter 22:44, his sweat became like great drops of blood falling upon the ground. What does that mean? Jesus did not enter into prayer lightly. It was something very sacred and precious and significant. Our prayer must be persistent. Someone said this, and I like this quote. I look at a stone cutter hammering away at a rock 100 times without so much as a crack showing in it. Yet at the 101st blow, it splits in two. I know it was not the one blow that did it, but all the ones that went before. Persistence in prayer, that's really the point of the parable. The host, even though it was late at night, battered and beat on the friend's door until finally he got an answer. The woman kept on pestering the judge until at last he did her justice. Thus Jesus says, ask, and as you know the Greek tense is keep on asking, and it will be given to you. Seek, keep on seeking, and you'll find. Knock, keep on knocking, and it will be opened. We have to continually do that. It's kind of interesting, too. There's two different words in the Greek language for knock, right? But the word that's used here, there's one that means to knock with a heavy blow. That's not the word that's used here. Instead, it's to knock with the knuckles. So it doesn't mean you bang the door down, right? It means a persistent, continual knock. A persistent, continual asking. A persistent, continual seeking of God. That's what God calls upon us to do. Not knock the door down, but to be persistent in our approach to Him. Our persistence demonstrates faith unto God. It shows how determined and how confident we are before Him. And the amazing thing about these two parables is that God is represented by the friend who got up. God is represented by the judge. What's the point? Can I change someone's mind if I'm persistent enough? Yes. Can I change God's mind if I'm persistent enough? Yes. Now, I know God has a will, but God's will can be bent. It can be altered based on how serious it is to us. It doesn't mean that God always does that. But if we say, God, I really want you to do this for me, it's really important, and then that's it, we never go back to God, and we're not persistent with it, then we show God it's really not that big of a deal to us. Our persistence says something about our faith. And then finally, the rewards of prayer. In these parables, we see that earnest prayer is rewarded. The host did not go away from his friend's door empty-handed, nor did the widow continue to suffer abuse from her enemy. Their efforts were favorably rewarded. Still in Luke tonight, look, if you will, at Luke chapter 11, verses 11 through 13. Luke 11 through 13. Now suppose one of your fathers is asked by his son for a fish. He will not give him a snake instead of a fish, will he? Or if he asks for an egg, he will not give him a scorpion, will he? If you then, being evil, that is, you're not really evil, but you're not anything like God, right? You're less than God. If you know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more your Heavenly Father gives the Holy Spirit to those who ask Him. What's Jesus saying here? Even though the disciples who are evil compared to God do not cruelly disdain their children's request, I mean, we would not substitute a stone for a loaf, or a fish for a serpent, or a scorpion for an egg. There was similarity in appearance between, for instance, a stone and a loaf. But God will neither give us anything that is useless or harmful. It's an interesting argument that God is using here. In fact, it's really the argument is really reasoning from a premise that it is less likely to occur to one that is more likely to occur. In other words, if it's not likely that a human parent would hatefully deceive and abuse his child, but would provide for him, it is certainly more likely that the great and benevolent God will do right by His children. These parables teach, then, that God gives blessing upon blessing to those who make sincere request of Him. Yet it's quite true, as you know, that prayers are not always answered in the affirmative, right? Sometimes God says yes. Sometimes God says no. Sometimes God says, you need to wait a while on this one. In spite of David's pleading in 2 Samuel chapter 12, his little baby child died, right? Paul's prayer in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, that his thorn in the flesh might be removed, was not taken away, was it? And surely Paul was a sincere person. And Paul prayed persistently about that. And yet the thorn in the side was not removed. The fact is that if God is indeed a wise Father, that as long as He is the supreme sovereign of the universe, there will be certain things that we ask for that cannot be granted. You've all heard this. I know some of you maybe. I'm not a big Garth Brooks fan, just for the record. But Garth Brooks wrote a song. I don't know if he wrote a song. He sung a song. Maybe he didn't write it. A few years ago, that whenever it comes on the radio, I'll turn it up because I think it's a pretty cool song. And it's called Unanswered Prayer. And the song doesn't really mean that God didn't answer the prayer, even though that's the title of the song. It means that sometimes God doesn't give us the answer that we thought we wanted at the time. He gives us a different answer that in hindsight was actually a better answer. So again, that song, just the other night at a hometown football game, my wife and I ran into my old high school flame. And as I introduced them, the past came back to me, and I couldn't help but think of the way things used to be. She was the one that I'd wanted for all times. And each night, I'd spend praying that God would make her mine. And if He'd only grant me this wish I wished back then, I'd never ask for anything again. Sometimes I thank God for unanswered prayers. Remember when you're talking to the man upstairs, that just because He doesn't answer doesn't mean He don't care. Some of God's greatest gifts are unanswered prayers. She wasn't quite the angel that I remembered in my dreams. And I could tell that time had changed me. In her eyes, too, it seemed. We tried to talk about the old days. There wasn't much we could recall. I guess the good Lord knows what He's doing after all. And as she walked away, and I looked at my wife, and then and there I thanked the good Lord for the gifts of my life. You know, it's possible today that we are praying for something which is directly opposite what we were praying for a year ago, right? Think about that. Oftentimes, we find ourselves thanking God because He did not answer some prayer in the past. This happens because we cannot see into the future, we do not understand the past, and we only know a little piece of the present. God alone knows the whole scheme of things. Therefore, the perfect prayer is the outpouring of a strong, intense desire, but with the humble resignation, not my will, but what? Your will be done, right? Not my will, but your will be done. Two powerful parables, right, about prayer. Let me tell you this. Prayer is a privilege. It's a privilege of those who are children of the Father. How do we start our prayers? Dear Heavenly, oftentimes what? Father. You only can call Him Father if you're a what? A child. Only if you're a child. Prayer is a privilege of being a Christian. And so by being a child of God, by being baptized into Christ, you are added to God's family. You're made one of His children, and then you have access to the throne of God. You have access to prayer. Prayer is a privilege of being a child of God. And since we have this sacred privilege, we shouldn't throw it away. We shouldn't minimize it. We shouldn't use it sparingly. We should continually be in prayer to God and thankful that this blessing has been given to us. Tonight, if you're not a Christian, you need to take that first step by being baptized into Christ, having your sins washed away, and then having that relationship where you can go to the Father in prayer. Perhaps you are a Christian, but as you reflect upon your life, you realize maybe you've not been living as you should. You want to recalibrate tonight. You want your brethren to pray for you and pray with you and ask God for forgiveness. If we can help you in any way, won't you please come forward while together we stand and sing.